Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Indians sessions on non-invasive brain stimulation. Today, we have Dr. Muralidharan Kesavan, who will be talking to us on TMS and its applications in clinical settings. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. So good afternoon to all of you. And it gives me great pleasure to be here as a part of this Indians initiative, and happy to be interacting with all of you via the internet to talk about transcranial magnetic stimulation and its applications in psychiatry. Again, just to introduce myself, I'm Dr. Muralidharan. I'm a professor of psychiatry and also deputy medical superintendent at NIMHANS, and have been working in the area of TMS for the last 15 years. So at the outset, I have no conflict of interest, and I'd like to acknowledge some of my colleagues from the Department of Psychiatry who contributed both in terms of knowledge as well as slides for my presentation. So I have no conflict of interest to disclose. So just to give you a brief idea about the evolution of TMS machine, as you can see, TMS is something that has been attempted even before ECT. 1896 was when D. Arsonval first attempted to use magnetic fields to modulate the effects of to modulate the activity of the brain. And over time, the TMS machine has evolved to what we have now. We have fairly advanced machines right now that allow us to stimulate the brain a lot deeper than what was possible maybe 15 years ago. And, we have newer coils which help us to target newer brain areas and more deeper regions of the cortex. So again, from 85, when the Sheffield magnet was first introduced to the world, till about 2005, where the practice of theta burst stimulation was introduced. So as you can see, this is a pictorial representation of what is low frequency RTMS and what is high frequency RTMS. So low frequency RTMS is 1 pulse per second or 1 hertz frequency, the impact of which is to reduce cortical excitability. High frequency RTMS is when the frequency is more than 1 hertz or more than 5 hertz, or more than 5, or to put it in simple term, 5 pulses per second, 5 magnetic pulses per second. So that is 5 hertz frequency, and above is high frequency RTMS. What you see right at the bottom of your screen is the protocol that is used for depression. 40 pulses per second for 2 seconds. That is a train of about 80 pulses. So that is the protocol that is used for depression. And this is theta burst stimulation. As you can see, instead of pulses, we use bursts. So each burst is a 3 pulse train, and each pulse is of 50 hertz frequency. So you get very high magnetic field that is given over a very short period of time. So that is the concept of theta burst stimulation. Again, you have continuous theta burst stimulation and you have intermittent theta burst stimulation. In intermittent theta burst stimulation, a time interval of about 8 seconds is given between 2 successive bursts, whereas in continuous theta burst stimulation, there is no time interval between bursts of stimuli. So, when we use RTMS for planning treatment and psychiatric disorders, what are the things that we need to keep in mind? So I'll just briefly take you through some of the aspects of treatment planning when using RTMS. Now, you can say that there are 5 or 6 steps that are involved in treatment planning. Like, for example, let's take a patient who is suffering from depression, who probably is not amenable for ECT, probably has contraindications for ECT, is not showing good response to standard antidepressant treatment. You decide that this patient is a good candidate for RTMS. So how do you decide a treatment for this patient? So once you've decided that RTMS is what would be administered, these are the things that I would recommend. One, screen for contraindications, determine the area of stimulation, locate the target of stimulation, also decide what is the type of coil to be used, and what are the stimulus parameters that need to be programmed. Okay, so in terms of contraindications, there are not too many absolute contraindications except for metallic implants very close to the vicinity of the coil. So medication pumps or cochlear implants. So to remember the rule of the thumb, anything that is a contraindication to an MRI is a contraindication to TMS. Relative contraindications, again, if there is a high risk of seizures, there's history of epilepsy in the past, there's any alcohol withdrawal state, you need to be a little careful. Always ask the patient if there is a family history of seizures. Uncertain risk, if there are implanted brain electrodes. Again, pregnancy is not a contraindication, but you may do well to ask if there is any, if for pregnancy, and any history suggestive of recent or severe heart disease. So these are some of the contraindications that you need to screen for. Some of these have been outlined by Rossi et al. In 2009. Again, the dictum is, even if you don't help, do no harm. So the first step is to screen for contraindications. Area of stimulation, like I said, it is based on the theoretical rationale and evidence that underlie each of the psychiatric disorders. Like, for example, the area to be stimulated varies for depression, for schizophrenia, and for OCD. And the other thing that is important is the access for stimulation. Now, if you want to stimulate a cortical area, it should be something that can be accessible to the TMS coil and to the magnetic field. So with the traditional TMS coils, the figure of 8 coils, the depth of stimulation is only about 2 centimeters, and the surface, so it's a conical area of stimulation with the depth being 2 centimeters, and the cortical surface area is about 3 square centimeters. So that's the total depth of stimulation that you can achieve with a TMS coil, which roughly translates into being able to stimulate the 4th layer of pyramidal cells of the cerebral cortex. Okay, so these are the areas that are accessible for stimulation through TMS. One is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is the most commonly stimulated area in TMS studies. Then you have the supplementary motor area, the superior frontal gyrus, temporoparietal junction, again for auditory hallucinations and schizophrenia. Motor cortex, of course, stimulation of the motor cortex forms the basis of almost all other stimulations. But stimulation of the motor cortex is particularly important for Parkinson's disease and other neurological conditions like movement disorders. Occipital cortex is another area that is accessible. And of course, the newer interest in psychiatry has been the role of cerebellum or cerebellar stimulation in the treatment of negative symptoms in schizophrenia. Then the third thing that you need is to locate the anatomical landmarks. So now we've decided, okay, these are the areas that we are going to stimulate. Let's say we're going to stimulate the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex on the left cerebral hemisphere. So how do you go about locating the target site? The most common way to do it for clinical purposes would be to use the EEG 1020 system, identify the motor cortex, locate an area that is about 2 centimeters to the lateral to the motor cortex, and measure it about 5 to 7 centimeters anterior from that spot. That would give you an approximate location of the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which would be roughly the F3 area of your EEG 1020 system. Once you've located the landmark, I think it's usually important for us to measure it from fixed anatomical landmarks so that you can use the same site for stimulation in subsequent sessions. Not very accurate. If you want to have a more accurate localization method, then you would need to rely on magnetic resonance imaging. So you have neuronavigation guided using neuronavigation, you can locate the target of stimulation and then obtain the coordinates from there and then use it for subsequent stimulation. Definitely more accurate, but a lot more cumbersome, needs specialized equipment for it, and is a lot more expensive. So using anatomical landmarks is the best way of localizing the target site. This is just a pictorial representation of the different target areas of stimulation with reference to the EEG 1020 system. As you can see, F3 is the location of the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. The area between T3 and P3 is the temporoparietal junction, which would be the site of stimulation for auditory hallucinations and schizophrenia. And the supplementary motor area is roughly about 2 centimeters anterior to the vertex in the sagittal plane, and that is the likely target of stimulation for OCD. The fourth thing is the type of coil. Now, the coil, the more diffuse the magnetic field, the lesser is the depth of penetration. So earlier we had the circular coils which were used, but now they're no longer used because it compromises the depth of stimulation. So most often that is used in psychiatry is the figure of 8 coil. The figure of 8 coil is about 7 centimeters in diameter. It has the copper wires running in it, which generates the electrical field. And this provides the stimulation, as I mentioned earlier, of about 2 centimeters deep. In addition to that, we have newer coils. These are the deep TMS coils. So what is represented here is the H coil. So you have many types of H coils. The H1 coil, which is used for stimulation and depression. The target of stimulation would be the left anterior cingulate as compared to the figure of 8 coil, which only allows you to stimulate up to the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Likewise, you have the H7 coil, which has been used for treatment in OCD. So the deep coils allow more deeper penetration. There is also a double cone coil, which can be used for the stimulation of the cerebellar nervus. Stimulus parameters. Again, this is most important. So the stimulus strength is usually a measure of the magnetic field that is displayed on the machine. So you would find that in most of the studies that, you say that what is the resting motor threshold. So the resting motor threshold is the minimum stimulus intensity at which you can get a twitch in your target muscle in at least 5 out of 10 trials. Or if you use an electromyograph, a peak-to-peak amplitude of 50 microvolts in about 50% of the trials. So the resting motor threshold is something that you have to elicit in almost all patients, in all the patients for whom TMS treatment is planned. And the stimulus strength is usually a percentage of the resting motor threshold. For example, studies may say it is 110% of resting motor threshold. So train frequency, duration, intensity, again, it depends upon the disorder that we're treating. Like I mentioned earlier, and I will mention a little while later, that for depression, we use 40 hertz frequency for over 2 seconds. Whereas for schizophrenia, we would use only 1 hertz frequency. The intertrain interval is again important, so that sufficient time is given between the trains to allow for relaxation. You also need to keep in mind the number of trains per session, number of sessions per day, and of course, the number of days for which the treatment has to be given. So these are some of the things that need to be determined a priori, especially keeping in mind the psychiatric condition that we're treating. So how do we know if the patient is going to respond well to TMS or not? So the important things to remember is that we need to have an idea about the illness-related variables. Treatment planning is very important in terms of understanding whether the patient is a suitable candidate for TMS or not. The rule of the thumb is if you think ECT will work for the patient, do not prescribe TMS. Use TMS in patients where ECT may not be indicated or may not be effective. Like, for example, patients with mixed anxiety depression, elderly patients with depression for whom anesthesia may be a risk. So choice of patient is very, very important in determining whether TMS would work or not. Apart from the other things that I've mentioned, the coil orientation is extremely important. So the coil has to be oriented in a way that has been prescribed. Otherwise, we may not be stimulating the target of treatment in a particular disorder. That itself could end up as a sham treatment rather than a real treatment. And of course, the site of stimulation, the intensity of stimulation, and the type of coil that we use all have a bearing on the treatment response to TMS. So what are the mechanisms of action of TMS? There is no, just like ECT, we don't really have one particular mechanism, but these are potential mechanisms. The most commonly accepted one being there is a long-term potentiation or a long-term depression like synaptic plasticity that is brought about by the different types of TMS. There is also evidence to show that there is an increase in the focal cerebral blood flow under the areas of stimulation by the transcranial magnetic stimulation equipment. Increase in transsynaptic glucose metabolism, enhancing gamma oxalate activity. So these are, again, not primarily neuronal. They're also something that are propagated by the synapses. So a lot of times we need to understand that the circuitry that are involved in particular psychiatric disorders are what are stimulated as a result of TMS. So it's not just about the area of stimulation, but also being able to locate the circuitry that are implicated in the different psychiatric conditions. Okay, so I'll briefly talk about 2 or 3 different psychiatric disorders for which TMS has been applied. The most common one in the FDA-approved indication is depression. And of course, most of the trials that we read and understand have been done in patients with treatment-resistant depression. So the question would be, does rTMS work for depression? The answer is yes, but we can actually make it work better than what we're doing right now by understanding where to stimulate, by manipulating and combining it with the brain state, by refining frequencies and patterns, and by understanding durability and repeated doses for maintaining remission. To put it in simple terms, we need to understand the site of stimulation better, manipulating, whether it's better off when the patient is in the resting state or in the active state, what are the frequencies and whether theta burst works better than rTMS, and what is the time duration for which we need to give rTMS. Now, if you look at the earlier studies, rTMS was given over a 2-week period, but now the recommendation is that we give rTMS at least for 4 to 6 weeks. So yes, it's a work in progress. We're trying to understand how to make TMS work better for depression than what it is doing currently. This is the most common protocol that is used for treatment of depression currently, where you give 40 pulses per second for 2 seconds. So a train is of 80 pulses, and that is, there's an intertrain interval of about 28 seconds. We give a total number of 45 trains, and the total number of pulses that is given in this particular protocol is 1,800 pulses per day. So 45 trains Each train consists of 40 pulses per second for 2 seconds with an intertrain interval of 28 seconds. So the entire treatment process may probably take about, say about half an hour. So that is the RTMS protocol that is now used as a standard for treatment of depression. Again, what is the target area of stimulation? The left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex or the F3 area. If you do it manually, if you try without the EEG 1020 system, if you were to do it, then after locating the motor cortex, measure 2 centimeters lateral to the motor cortex and about 5 or 7 centimeters anterior to the motor cortex would be the target of stimulation. So once you find the target of stimulation, I would recommend that you measure out this site from fixed anatomical landmarks, either from the tragus or from the nasion, and the point of intersection of these two lines using an inch tape is what would give you the coil location on the scalp. So once you measure it out, you can be reasonably sure that you're stimulating the same spot every day, which is very good for ensuring that the treatment response is better. So moving on a little bit about the evidence for use of RTMS for depression. So you can find that there's a recent meta-analysis that looked at the various treatment protocols that have been used for depression. You have studies that have used left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex or low frequency RTMS for high frequency RTMS to the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, low frequency RTMS to the right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, bilateral RTMS, deep TMS, and patterned TMS, and then you have theta burst stimulation, accelerated TMS. So these are different TMS parameters that have been tried for depression. As you can see from this network here, most studies have looked at high frequency RTMS in comparison to sham TMS. And as you can see from the forest plot, the response and remission rates are significantly higher for active RTMS as compared to sham RTMS. So there is reasonable evidence to say that yes, RTMS seems to work well if indicated in patients with depression, and most of the evidence seems to be pointing towards the role of or the efficacy of high frequency RTMS to the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Again, like I said, most of the RTMS treatments have looked at treatment-resistant depression. So the recent meta-analysis looked at 23 RCTs that compared the effect of RTMS with sham and 6 RCTs which compared RTMS with ECT. And they found that there was a 10% absolute difference between active RTMS and sham RTMS in the rates of response and remission. And number needed to treat was 10, and there was no publication bias detected. So it's an important analysis which tells us that yes, RTMS, if used correctly, is very, very efficacious in treating treatment-resistant depression. It was just the forest plot from that particular study. And again, as you would understand and as you would have guessed, it does not work as well for as compared to ECT. So RTMS is not as comparable to ECT in treatment-resistant depression, but then compared to sham RTMS, active RTMS seem to have greater efficacy in treating treatment-resistant depression. So what are the determinants for good response to treatment? One is it was seen from this particular study that patients who are younger, who have lower level of depressive severity, like for example, patients with severe depression may not respond as well to RTMS. If RMT was used at over 100%, patient getting more than 1,000 pulses per session. Like we've said in this protocol that we are using now as standard, about 1,800 pulses per session is what is used. More than 10 days of treatment, which is again in keeping with the current recommendations where the patient is treated for about 4 to 6 weeks. And some of the other things are, from genetic studies which looked at LL genotype on the 5-HTT-LPR transporter gene. So these are not as, clinically relevant, but though important, they may not have immediate clinical relevance. But then remember, younger age patients, lower severity of the depressive episodes, so those with mild to moderate depression, using an RMT of over 100% stimulator output, at least 1,000 stimulations per session and more than 10 days of treatment, and as accurate a localization as possible with the available resources could help in better response to TMS. Now, there's another thing that a new study that has looked at the accelerating effect of antidepressant medication. Now, if you give only TMS as compared to the impact of medication. So this is TMS as an add-on treatment to antidepressant treatment. They found that true RTMS actually had better efficacy when administered along with other antidepressant treatments as compared to sham TMS. So that's about unipolar depression. Now there's not much in terms of bipolar depression. Again, bipolar depression is a very, very important challenge for clinicians. They're more difficult to treat simply because it's not easy for us to use antidepressants in bipolar depression. A lot of times we have to rely on second generation antipsychotics that have efficacy against bipolar depression. So treating bipolar depression always is a challenge, and prophylaxis against bipolar depression is an even greater challenge. So we have a meta-analysis here that has looked at the efficacy and safety of rTMS in acute bipolar depression. So what are the findings of this study? Again, as you know, the numbers were very small. As you can see, there were only about 99 subjects in the active arm and 77 subjects in the sham arm. But the forest plot did show that the odds ratio or the for improvement was significantly in favor of rTMS as compared to sham rTMS. So rTMS seems to have some efficacy in treating bipolar depression too. Now, again, when you looked at the type of rTMS that seem to work well, you can see if you divide the studies into high frequency studies, low frequency studies, and theta burst studies, you can see that most of the efficacy is driven by high frequency studies. So high frequency rTMS to the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex seems to have a significant benefit in significantly more efficacious than sham in treating bipolar depression. The important thing to remember here is that the switch rates were very, very low. They were negligible. There were hardly any switch reported in patients who received rTMS for bipolar depression. And the adverse effects in this study was comparable to adverse effects from the other unipolar depression studies. So there is no additional risk of switch, but the efficacy is quite comparable to that of unipolar depression. So rTMS seems to have a role even in bipolar depression. Moving on to schizophrenia, again now, unlike depression where we use rTMS to treat the disorder, within schizophrenia, we can't really use rTMS to treat schizophrenia by itself. So there are indications within schizophrenia where rTMS can be tried. And the couple of indications where rTMS have been tried in schizophrenia are: one is to reduce persistent auditory hallucinations in schizophrenia, to treat negative symptoms in schizophrenia, and for cognitive enhancement in schizophrenia. So some of the strategies that have been used are conventional TMS, like we've been describing all the while, versus theta burst stimulation, standalone versus combination treatments, and the neuronavigation is something that has been used more frequently. So if you look at the evidence for schizophrenia studies, there are 25 RCTs which have looked at rTMS for sham versus sham rTMS for auditory hallucinations in schizophrenia. The meta-analysis showed that the effect size of, or mean weighted effect size of about 0.44, meaning that rTMS. So here we are talking about low frequency rTMS, which is something that I would like to remind all of you, that we are using 1 Hertz rTMS to the temporoparietal junction, and that was significantly more efficacious than sham rTMS in treating auditory hallucinations in schizophrenia. Yeah, so this is the meta-analysis there. As you can see, rTMS was found to be more efficacious than sham rTMS in treating auditory hallucinations in schizophrenia. Again, if you can look at the subgroups within the study, you can find that most of these studies have looked at T3-P3 junction or the temporoparietal junction. So the effect sizes on these studies were comparable to that of clozapine versus typical antipsychotic. So you could say that rTMS versus sham had similar effect sizes as clozapine versus other typical antipsychotics in reducing auditory hallucinations. The important thing is that after stopping rTMS treatment, the effect seemed to sustain for about 4 to 6 weeks. So I think the long-term potentiation that was seen as a result of TMS was able to bring about lasting improvement about 4 to 6 weeks. Whether there is a role for booster TMS sessions is something that needs to be studied or worked out with respect to individual patients. The effect of reinstitution of TMS following a relapse is not very encouraging. Some studies have shown that after reinstituting TMS, the patients got better, whereas other studies have not shown much improvement. And augmenting strategy, in addition to other antipsychotics, is something that has been recommended. Moving on to negative symptoms in schizophrenia. Again, high frequency rTMS to the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is something that has been studied most. A total of about 9 studies have been seen in this meta-analysis, and there is some evidence to suggest that true rTMS may have slightly superior efficacy than sham RTMS in treating negative symptoms of schizophrenia. The important thing to remember here is that most of these studies probably did not account for improvement in depression. They probably did not, so it could be a significant confounding factor that we need to keep in mind. And studies showed that with longer duration of treatment, there's better efficacy. So if somebody received treatment for at least 3 weeks, then the efficacy in treating negative symptoms were definitely better than in studies of smaller duration. So moving on to RTMS and addiction medicine. So I'll quickly run through some of these slides. Again, there's not too much of information on addiction medicine. Again, these are the sites that have been stimulated in addiction: dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, again the superior prefrontal cortex, inferior prefrontal cortex. So most of these have been tried, but again, most of the studies would focus on the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Yeah. So in terms of alcohol studies, most of the RTMS studies have looked at craving as the outcome measure in alcohol. So what is the impact of RTMS on craving? There are a total of 6 studies that we could identify. 5 of them are sham-controlled RCTs, and there's one open-label deep TMS study using the H coil. In terms of high-frequency RTMS, you can find that it did not actually show that there was any significant difference between active and sham RTMS in terms of the efficacy in treating addictive disorder. The effect size, as you can see, it did not reach statistically significant. The numbers in this study were quite small. Most of the studies were about 14 subjects or 15 subjects, but then the meta did not show any superior efficacy for RTMS in treating craving from alcohol. Okay. Now, looking at theta burst theta burst stimulation in ADS. This is a study that was done here, where we used 4 groups of subjects with alcohol dependence. 60 patients were divided into 4 groups, and they were randomized after they underwent detoxification. Now, what these 4 groups were is: Group A received high frequency RTMS to the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and low frequency RTMS to the right dorsolateral. So bilateral true RTMS. Group B received active RTMS on the left hemisphere and sham RTMS on the right, theta burst in the right hemisphere. Sorry. Group C received a sham on the left and a real theta burst on the right hemisphere, and Group D received sham bilaterally. So the findings of the study were that time to first heavy drinking was significantly different between all the groups, at least in the first 2 weeks, with the group receiving left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex stimulation showing the longer time to first heavy drinking. And this was maintained at about 12 weeks follow-up. So there is some evidence to show that, okay, though we expected bilateral stimulation to have greater efficacy, it was the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex stimulation that showed superior efficacy in time to first heavy drinking. Of course, the patients received a very short duration of treatment. Maybe with longer duration of treatment, the effect probably would have been more pronounced. Nicotine dependence, again, the area that has been studied most is the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. There are a total of about 9 studies on craving or cigarette count. 5 studies have looked at the stimulation of the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, 2 on the right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and 1 RCT on bilateral stimulation. This is just a summary of the studies. As you can see, most of the studies have looked at very small sample sizes of between 10 and 14, but one study which was done by Amias et al. In 2009, they had about 48 subjects. They looked at 10 Hz frequency at 90% of the resting motor threshold to the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. A total of 1,000 pulses per session were administered, and they found that there was a significant reduction in both craving and cigarette count, or the number of cigarettes smoked per day, in the active group as compared to the sham group. So this is a fairly large, comparatively larger sample size as compared to some of the other studies. There's another study by Dealer et al. In 2014, which looked at 75 subjects who received intermittent theta burst stimulation, again 600 pulses per session to the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex at 80% of the resting motor threshold. And this was about 4 sessions, and they found higher abstinence rates in 3 months in the active stimulation group. So there is enough evidence to suggest that RTMS or theta burst stimulation can be used with some degree of success in treating nicotine dependence, or bringing down craving from nicotine dependence. I'll quickly run through cocaine and other studies. Again, this is not. There are not too many studies here. There are very few studies which have looked at craving. They found that stimulation of the light DLPFC. Again, we need to remember that since cocaine is an activating substance, most of these studies would use low frequency RTMS. But again, here we find that they've used 15 hertz RTMS, 2400 pulses per session. And they found a significant reduction in cocaine craving. This is a study by Terenou et al. In 2016. I could find only a couple of studies on pathological gambling. Again, behavioral addiction, where they found that, a deep RTMS at 1 hertz frequency at 110% of the motor threshold to the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex did not bring about much changes in gambling behavior. Whereas another study, which is published more recently in 2019, they found 15 hertz, high frequency RTMS to the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. They were given twice daily sessions, unlike earlier TMS studies or other TMS studies. Here they're giving twice daily TMS, and they found a 70% reduction in gambling behavior. So there is some little evidence to see that RTMS may be used with some benefits in patients with alcohol dependence and nicotine dependence, probably in a few patients with pathological gambling where there are no other contraindications. What are the common side effects with RTMS? Pain and discomfort over the head and neck, muscle twitches. Very few patients have reported hearing impairment or some change in cognition. Again, most of this happens as a result of stimulation of the local musculature and not so much because of the deeper influences of TMS. Seizures is a significant adverse effect, and of course, most of the modifications in TMS over time has been with the intention of maintaining the therapeutic efficacy while reducing the seizures. Again, the contraindications just for repetition, past history of seizures, any metallic implants that could be a contraindication for MRI, pregnancy. These are some of the contraindications that one must keep in mind. Thank you for your attention. Again, TMS is not something that it's something that you need to experience. It's not something where you can understand theoretically. That is something that we recognize. So the common example that I give most of my students is that your TMS machine is like a cell phone or like a smartphone. You use it every day, then you know what to do with it. The TMS machine is very much like that. If you operate the machine on a daily basis or frequently, you know what to do with it, you know where to put it, you know how to hold the coil. So with time, with experience, it becomes quite easy for you to be able to use TMS. So it's a matter of having access to the machine, trying as much as possible to use the machine. Then you'd find that you're very comfortable using it.
Dr. Utkarsh Kumar, can you please unmute your mic and ask the question? So
the question is the role of RTMS in OCD. Yeah, so again, you can look at 2 or 3 different studies that are there. Earlier studies again looked at left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex stimulation without much success. Then it was decided to target a different circuitry which is implicated in OCD. And the supplementary motor area stimulation was then investigated in a few studies, again, with not much success. RTMS studies did not find much efficacy for RTMS in treating OCD. Again, there was a study that was done at NIMHANS, which is again not very successful. Of late, the emphasis is on using intermittent theta burst stimulation to the supplementary motor area for treating OCD. So as you can see, as you may be able to see, there is the scope of theta burst stimulation and again deep stimulation that has been tried in OCD. Particular importance is the H coil or the H7 coil, which has been developed specifically for treatment of OCD. And yeah, so as you can see, there are a couple of studies here which have looked at stimulation of theta. This is deep TMS for treatment of OCD, and they found that active TMS was deep TMS was significantly more efficacious in treating OCD over 10 weeks as compared to sham deep TMS. Again, deep TMS, you remember the coil is the H coil, and for OCD they specifically use the H7 coil. That is not available anywhere in India right now. I think very recently CIP Ranchi has purchased the H1 coil, but the H7 coil is not available in any center in India. And the cost of the coil is roughly about 1.5 crore. So it's not something that can be acquired. Even NIMHANS does not have a H coil as yet, but we hope to get one soon. So yeah, there is some evidence that is emerging that deep TMS may be more efficacious in treating obsessive compulsive disorder, but the standard RTMS that is currently available in most centers is not efficacious in treating OCD. What is the cost of setting up an RTMS machine? C56. Second question is having a titanium implant in C56 space a contraindication for TMS? Again, I'm not sure if I can answer the second question. Titanium implants are, as long as it is, I think titanium implants are now allowed. These are MRI compatible, so it should not be an issue, but please do check again once. I'm just saying it from what I've read and what I've discussed with experts, but titanium implants are not contraindications. Now, the first question, what is the cost of setting up an RTMS machine? Now, it depends entirely on what you want to do. Now, if it is exclusively for treatment purposes, where you are not using neuronavigation, where you're not using EMG coupled equipment, then I think the cost is roughly about 20 to 25 lakhs for the machine, for the TMS machine. And if you want the machine to do something more than just administer RTMS, like for example, if you're looking at theta burst stimulation, then probably the cost of the machine is a little bit more. It probably goes up to about 30 lakhs. But if you want a machine that also allows you to do ENMG along with TMS, then it would again go up. Just keep adding 10 or 15 lakhs to the cost of the machine. So that's what could happen. But for treatment purposes, if you just use the regular anatomical landmarks for delivering treatment, I think the cost of the machine would be roughly about 20 to 25 lakhs. So side effects of TMS, and can this hinder follow-ups? Yeah, it's a very important question. Again, like we said, do no harm is the first dictum that we follow in general medicine, and the same thing applies to TMS also. So like I said, to minimize side effects, the most important thing for us is to screen the patient very well for possible contraindications. The side effects that we have seen most commonly in our center, apart from what the literature says, is pain at the site of stimulation. A lot of them find that a little disconcerting. See, what happens when you give high frequency RTMS is that there is a lot of local stimulation. So you'll have a stimulation of the facial musculature. Sometimes we've seen patients having, twitching of the orbicularis oris, or you can, the stimulation of the other superficial muscles of the face. And that can be quite disconcerting to the patient, though it does not have any lasting effects, but then the discomfort is something that can be quite disconcerting. So a lot of times it's reassurance to the patient and explaining to them that this will just go away. This is happening because of local stimulation. It's not because of anything else more deep. A lot of times they can get reassured. In order to help them understand this better, I would usually suggest that at the beginning of TMS treatment, stimulate the patient's forearm with your TMS apparatus and help them understand how the muscle twitch works. So that kind of gives them an idea about what is happening. So, anywhere there's a muscle, if you put the TMS coil and give a pulse, you'll find a twitch. And, it's sometimes reassuring that, yes, it's more of a local stimulation. Headache is something that has been reported by a lot of patients. Again, not all patients report headache, but not all patients report headache in all sessions. But there are occasions when patients have reported severe headache, in which case it is very, very important for you to treat it symptomatically if the pain is unbearable. Other side effects are very, very minimal. Like I said, if you screen carefully, the risk of seizures are very, very less. We've had a couple of patients here who've developed seizures, and then we realized later that the family history of seizures and past history of seizures were not disclosed to the treating team before we started the treatment, but that was many years ago. In the last 4 or 5 years, we've not had any patient developing seizures. So the next question, okay, and can these side effects hinder follow-ups? Yes, if the patient is not reassured with the explanation that you give, probably they would feel very, very uncomfortable about coming back and sitting in the TMS chair. But I guess it's a combination of helping the patient understand that these are not serious side effects and reassuring the patient. Again, physician-patient contact is something that is very, very important, like in all other treatments, in TMS treatment too. So reassuring the patient is most important to ensure that they do come back for follow-up. there's a next question is that, is there a chance of generalized seizure while administering TMS? The answer is yes. The answer is yes for high frequency RTMS and theta burst stimulation. As far as I remember, initially there were about 9 reports of generalized tonic-clonic seizures with RTMS, and one of them was from NIMHANS 2. So what has happened over time is that we've evolved, very careful screening mechanism internationally to minimize the risk of developing seizures. And what has also happened with TMS practice over the years is that we have tried to develop protocols that minimize the risk of seizures without compromising on the efficacy of RTMS. So if you would look at literature, earlier people were using 20 Hertz frequency RTMS and smaller number of sessions. The idea was that you'd give more pulses per session. So now what we do, we give only 10 Hertz RTMS, or we give 40 Hertz RTMS for a shorter period of time. So the total number of pulses that a patient receives in a train is lesser, and it's given over a shorter period of time. So these are all with the intention of maximizing efficacy, reducing the time spent on the machine, while at the same time minimizing the risk of generalized seizures. This is after you have screened the patient for seizures. So yes, there is a chance, but then you need to screen the patient carefully, and the protocols are now designed in such a way that the risk of seizures can be minimized. So the next question is, how many cycles for remission of depression? How frequently can we use along with ECT ketamine infusion? Any comparison to ECT, any other form of antidepressant treatment, memory impairment with RTMS? Okay, there's a lot of questions, but I'll try and answer all of them. How many cycles for remission of depression? Now, the standard protocol that I recognize now is that you give TMS every day for 4 to 6 weeks. So minimum of 4 weeks. So you're talking about 20 sessions of RTMS to bring about good response or remission. And if you want to give 30 sessions, you're welcome to do so. The FDA approved protocol is 4 weeks or 20 sessions of RTMS. Again, they say 4 weeks because they work only 5 days a week in the US. And unlike us who work 6 days a week. So your treatment can actually get over in 3.5 weeks if you give, or even less than that if you give TMS every day. So 20 sessions of RTMS or 4 weeks of RTMS, and 4 to 6 weeks for maximum improvement. TMS has to be given every day as per this protocol. Now, newer protocols are now looking at, whether accelerated TMS, where, you try and give more than one session of RTMS per day in order to reduce the number of days. Again, all of us will acknowledge that having the patient come in every day for 4 to 6 weeks is practically impossible, and it can be done only with highly motivated patients or patients who have paid a hell of a lot of money to come to you for treatment. Otherwise, getting the patient into the treatment room is a big, big challenge, especially in centers where you don't charge for treatment. So reducing the number of days of treatment by increasing the number of sessions per day is something that is being tried, and there is some emerging evidence that it is quite efficacious in treating depression. I think we'll be having more literature shortly in terms of more frequent sessions. Again, the concept has been borrowed from TDCS studies, where patients get TDCS 2 or 3 times a day, so that the treatment gets over in about 5 days. Similar attempts are being made with RTMS. And again, like I said, the idea is that the patient can get more treatment sessions, but should not trigger of seizures. So it has to be a balance between the efficacy and the side effects. Can we use along with ECT? No. If you're using ECT, don't think of any other treatment. Absolutely no. If ECT is working, TMS will not work. To give you an example, it would be like, unleashing an elephant and an ant on the same person. The ant is immaterial. So any comparison? Yes, there are some studies which have compared ECT and TMS, and of course, ECT will win any day. TMS is not comparable to ECT at all. So if you have to use between ECT and TMS, always go for ECT. TMS, only when ECT cannot be indicated, maybe it would be a good choice to use. In terms of treatment-resistant depression, yes, most of the TMS studies have been in treatment-resistant depression, especially, and there's a meta-analysis which has shown that active RTMS to the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is far efficacious than sham RTMS in treating treatment-resistant depression. So yes, that is one of the indications for treatment-resistant depression. And I'm not aware of any memory impairment with TMS. In fact, TMS is something that has been tried as a mechanism for enhancing cognitive performance in patients with, especially with schizophrenia. So cognitive enhancement with theta burst stimulation, cognitive enhancement by stimulation of the cerebellar vermis is something that has been tried in patients with schizophrenia. Ketamine infusion is probably more comparable to ECT. You know, it's almost like you give alternate days ketamine, you give alternate day ECT. You give 6 sessions of ECT, you give 6 sessions of ketamine. So ketamine has more procedural closeness with ECT, and I think there are studies which have actually compared ECT and ketamine, and again, as expected, found ECT to be far superior to ketamine. Ketamine probably has a little more acceptability to the patient than ECT, because as we know, ECT is far more stigmatized, though it is the most effective antidepressant available. So I'll just share a few more slides with you, which I thought I'll share if I have time. Now, since we have a couple of minutes, I'll just share some other info. So again, theta burst stimulation is again an improvement on the standard RTMS, where you use bursts of 50 Hertz frequency, 3 bursts of theta frequency. That is why it's called the theta burst stimulation. Again, now the comparison studies are looking at whether theta burst versus high frequency RTMS, which is more efficacious, and the role of cerebellar prefrontal network connectivity and the role of negative symptoms in schizophrenia. So these are the 2 indications for which theta burst stimulation is currently used. Theta burst stimulation was again developed by Huang et al. The idea was to stimulate the patient with high bursts of magnetic pulses over a very short period of time. One of the studies that was done in NIMHANS here looked at whether theta burst stimulation has better efficacy in treating depression. So it was actually a study where we compared earlier protocols of RTMS versus subsequent patients receiving theta burst stimulation, and we found that from 2014 to 2016 we were using conventional TMS, and from 2016 to April 2018 we used more patients with RTMS. So the total treatment time that the patient was taking earlier was about 40 minutes, but once we shifted the patient to theta burst stimulation, we were able to bring down the time of treatment to about 12 minutes, and without compromising on the efficacy. And the findings that we obtained were comparable to that of the Blumberger study et al. In terms of the response and remission rates. So most common indications for theta burst stimulation is one is to augment standard antidepressant treatment. The next important indication is for treatment resistance. And like I said, where you can't prescribe ECT, if you want to look at another mode of experience, then non-feasibility of ECT was the common reasons. But theta burst stimulation was used as an augmentation treatment strategy for most of our patients. Yeah, and the findings of our study were comparable to that of the Blumberger study. We have found that more than 45% of the patients who received theta burst stimulation showed good clinical response. No incidence of seizures, again, which is something that we were worried about, and reduction of stimulation intensity was required in some of the patients. Most common side effect, as someone had asked earlier, like with RTMS, even with theta burst stimulation, discomfort during the session due to local muscle stimulation was the most common side effect. So in terms of theta burst stimulation for schizophrenia, there was a Wellcome Trust funded study that was carried out here by one of our research fellows. We looked at the role of intermittent theta burst stimulation to the cerebellar vermis with the intention of seeing whether it brings about improvement in negative symptoms in schizophrenia. Now again, 60 patients with schizophrenia were randomized to 2 arms. One arm receiving true theta burst and the other arm is receiving sham theta burst. The patients received 10 sessions of theta burst in 5 days, 2 sessions per day. And while we found that there was a slight reduction in the negative symptom scores as compared to the sham theta burst stimulation, it was not statistically significant. But what we did find was that the connectivity seems to have improved between the cerebral cortex and the frontal circuitry. So it is likely that with more sessions with different stimulation parameters, intermittent theta burst stimulation to the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex may actually be efficacious in reducing negative symptoms of schizophrenia. Theta burst stimulation for alcohol dependence I've done. Yeah. And deep TMS again is an emerging area. The coils are being made available for use in depression and OCD, and I'm sure we'll see a lot of studies in the near future about the role of deep TMS for treatment of depression and for the treatment of OCD. Thanks.
We thank Dr. Murli sir for taking his time in his busy schedule to take the session. We thank you, sir. I would like to place on record our sincere thanks to Linux Laboratories for their support through educational platform. Thank you, one and all.